Picture this. It's 1917. The Great War has torn Europe apart. Snow falls like tears from a grey sky over a grand English manor, and in that snow, a broken hero lies dying, while the world around him stays silent. But today, I'm going to tell you a story that will make your heart race and your eyes fill with tears. A story of love that breaks all rules. A story of two souls who found each other in the darkest hour of human history. This is the tale of Captain James Whitmore and Elara, a love so powerful it changed everything. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will shock you. December 1917. The war has been raging for 3 long bloody years. Captain James Whitmore was once the pride of the British Army, tall, strong, with eyes as blue as summer skies. He led his men through hell itself at the Battle of Passchendaele. But war takes everything from everyone. The explosion came without warning. A German shell landed right next to James and his unit. When the smoke cleared, 12 good men lay dead. And James opened his eyes to complete darkness. The doctors tried everything. "I'm sorry, Captain," the army doctor said, his voice heavy with sadness. "The shrapnel damaged your optic nerves. You'll never see again. Never see again." Imagine hearing those words when you're only 28 years old. James came home to Whitmore Manor, his family's estate in the English countryside. But he wasn't the same man who left. He walked with a cane now, feeling his way through rooms that used to be as familiar as his own heartbeat. His mother, Lady Margaret Whitmore, hired the best servants money could buy, but James pushed everyone away. "Leave me alone," he would shout when servants tried to help him eat. "I don't need your pity." He spent his days locked in his room, drinking whiskey and cursing his fate. The brave captain who once saved hundreds of lives now couldn't even find his way to the bathroom without help. But fate had other plans. Her name was Elara Rose. She was 22 years old, with hair as dark as midnight and eyes like warm honey. But Elara had never spoken a single word in her entire life. She was born mute. The doctor said there was nothing wrong with her throat or tongue. Sometimes, he explained to her mother, the mind just chooses silence. Elara's family was poor. Very poor. When she was 18, she came to work at Whitmore Manor as a kitchen maid. She scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and cleaned rooms. The other servants barely noticed her. That quiet girl, they called her. Strange one, isn't she? But Elara wasn't strange. She was watching. Always watching. She saw everything. The cook stealing sugar, the butler drinking Lord Whitmore's wine, the young maids gossiping about the master's son. And when Captain James came home broken and angry, Elara saw something else. She saw pain. Not just in his body, but in his soul. The other servants were afraid of him now. "He throws things when he's angry," whispered Mary, the head maid. "Yesterday he broke 3 plates, said Thomas, the footman. "Poor man," sighed Mrs. Henderson, the cook. "But someone needs to take care of him." Nobody wanted that job. Nobody except Elara. Lady Margaret was desperate. "Please," she begged Elara one snowy morning, "just bring him his meals, clean his room. The others won't go near him anymore." Elara nodded. She always nodded. Words weren't needed when your heart spoke loud enough. December 15th, 1917. The day everything changed. Elara knocked softly on James's door. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. She pushed the door open slowly. The room smelled of whiskey and sadness. Heavy curtains blocked out all the light. Not that it mattered to James anymore. He was sitting in his chair by the cold fireplace, still wearing the same clothes from 3 days ago. His hair was messy, his face covered with stubble. This wasn't the proud captain in the family portraits downstairs. "Go away," he said without turning around. "I don't want breakfast. I don't want anything." But Alara didn't leave. She never left when someone needed help. She placed the breakfast tray on the table and walked quietly to the fireplace. She had brought wood from downstairs. Within minutes, warm orange flames were dancing in the hearth. James turned his head toward the sound. "I said go away. Who are you anyway?" "You're not Mary." Alara wanted to answer, but she couldn't. Instead, she walked to the window and pulled open the curtains. Bright winter sunlight flooded the room. "Close those," James shouted, standing up quickly. Too quickly. He forgot about the table next to his chair. His shin hit it hard, and he stumbled forward. Lara rushed to catch him, but James fell anyway. His hands hit the stone hearth, and blood started flowing from deep cuts on his palms. "Damn it all to hell," James cursed, trying to push himself up, but his cut hands couldn't support his weight. Most people would have run for help, called for the doctor, screamed for Lady Margaret. But Alara wasn't like most people. She knelt beside him in the silence. Gently, so gently, she took his bleeding hands in hers. James froze. "What are you doing? Don't touch me." But her touch wasn't like the others. It wasn't full of pity or fear. Her hands were warm, soft, and careful. She examined his cuts like she was holding something precious. "Let go of me," James whispered, but his voice had lost its anger. Alara tore strips from her own apron and began cleaning his wounds. Her touch was so gentle that James barely felt any pain. She worked in complete silence, wrapping his hands with the skill of someone who had cared for many injuries before. When she finished, James's hands were bandaged perfectly, clean, dry, safe. "Why?" James asked quietly. "Why aren't you afraid of me like the others?" Alara looked at his face. Really looked at him. His eyes were still beautiful, even though they couldn't see. They were the color of storms over the ocean. And in those stormy eyes, she saw the same loneliness that lived in her own heart. She touched his cheek. Just once, so softly it felt like a whisper. Then she stood up, picked up the breakfast tray, and left. James sat there on the floor for a long time, touching the spot where her hand had been. The next morning, Alara came back, and the morning after that, and every morning for 2 weeks. She never spoke, but she spoke volumes. She brought him fresh clothes and helped him dress without making him feel helpless. She guided his hand to show him where everything was on his breakfast tray. She read to him from the newspaper, her finger following the words on the page as if he could see them. Wait, how did she read to him if she couldn't speak? Alara was clever. Very clever. She had learned to read by watching the cook follow recipes, and she found other ways to communicate. She would tap once for yes, twice for no. She would place his hand on different objects to show him what she meant. She would guide him around the room, teaching him where everything was located. "You're teaching me to live again," James said one morning as she helped him shave. "But I don't even know your name." Alara smiled. She took his hand and traced letters on his palm with her finger. Elara. Alara, James repeated slowly. "That's beautiful. It means bright star in Latin, doesn't it?" She squeezed his hand. "Yes. And you can't speak at all?" 2 squeezes. "No." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made Alara's heart skip a beat. "You know what, Alara? You don't need words. You say more in your silence than most people say in a lifetime." From that day on, they developed their own language. Hand squeezes, gentle touches, the way she moved around the room. James began to read her moods by the sound of her footsteps. Light, quick steps meant she was happy. Slow, careful steps meant she was worried about something, and when she was sad, she moved like a ghost. "Tell me about yourself," James said one afternoon as she arranged flowers by his bedside. She had brought them from the garden, winter roses that somehow survived the cold. Elara took his hand and began to trace her story on his skin. Her father died when she was young. Her mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. She had 2 younger brothers who needed her help. "That's why you're so good at taking care of people," James said softly. "You've been doing it your whole life." She placed his hand over her heart. He could feel it beating fast. "Elara," James whispered, I think I'm falling in love with you." The room went completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to stop blowing. Then Elara did something she had never done before. She took James's hand and placed it on her lips. Then she pressed those lips to his palm in the gentlest kiss. It was her way of saying, "I love you too." But love stories are never simple, especially not in 1917. Lady Margaret discovered their secret on a cold January morning. She walked into James's room without knocking and found Elara braiding his hair. They were sitting together on his bed, laughing about something. James was laughing. Her broken, angry son was actually laughing. "What is the meaning of this?" Lady Margaret's voice cut through the room like ice. Elara jumped up quickly, but James stayed calm. "Mother," he said, "this is Elara. She's been taking care of me." "Taking care of you?" Lady Margaret's voice rose higher. "She's a servant, a mute servant." "She's the woman I love," James said firmly. Lady Margaret gasped. "James Whitmore, you will not disgrace this family. You're a war hero, a captain. You can't possibly think you could marry the most wonderful woman I've ever met." James stood up, his hand finding Elara's arm. "Yes, Mother, that's exactly what I think. This is ridiculous." Lady Margaret was shouting now. "She can't even speak. How would you introduce her to society? What would people say?" "I don't care what people say." "Well, I do. Elara, you're dismissed. Pack your things and leave this house immediately." "No." James stepped in front of Elara. "She's not going anywhere." But Elara touched his arm gently. When he turned to her, she shook her head. She pointed to herself, then to the door, then squeezed his hand twice. No. She was saying no, she wouldn't stay and cause problems for him. "Elara, please," James begged, but she was already walking toward the door. She stopped and looked back at him one last time. The look in her eyes said everything. "I love you. I'll always love you. But I won't destroy your life." Then she was gone. James stood there, reaching toward empty air. "Elara, Elara." But for the first time since she'd entered his life, his voice was met with only silence. The next 3 weeks were the longest of James's life. He stopped eating, stopped shaving, stopped getting out of bed. He had learned to live again, and now he had to learn to survive without his reason for living. "Please, James," Lady Margaret begged. "I found you a lovely girl, Charlotte Pemberton. She's from a good family, and she doesn't mind that you can't see." "Get out," James said quietly. "She's coming for tea this afternoon. At least meet her. Get out." Lady Margaret left, but she didn't give up. She invited Charlotte anyway. Charlotte Pemberton was everything a proper English lady should be. Beautiful, well-educated, from a wealthy family. She spoke French and played piano. She was perfect. She was also completely wrong for James. "Oh, Captain Whitmore," Charlotte gushed when she met him. "You're so brave, fighting for our country even though you can't see. How inspiring." James wanted to throw something. Charlotte talked about his blindness like it was a cute pet trick. "Tell me about the war," she continued. "It must have been so exciting." Exciting? Watching his friends die was exciting? Meanwhile, Alara had returned to her mother's tiny cottage. She helped take care of her brothers, did washing for neighbors, anything to earn money, but every night she cried herself to sleep. She would trace James's name on her pillow in the dark. She would remember the way he laughed when she tickled his chin while shaving him. She would think about his hands, always searching for hers. Her mother noticed her sadness. "What's wrong, my dear?" she asked in sign language. Ilara's family had learned basic signs to communicate with her. Ilara signed back, "I fell in love with someone I can never have." "The young master at the manor?" Ilara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my child," her mother said softly, "love doesn't care about rich or poor, but the world isn't always ready for love." One night, Ilara couldn't take it anymore. She put on her coat and walked through the snow to Whitmore Manor. She didn't plan to go inside. She just wanted to see his window, to know he was safe. But when she got there, she saw something that broke her heart. Through the window, she could see James with Charlotte. Charlotte was playing piano while James sat in his chair, looking miserable. Lady Margaret was smiling and clapping. They were planning his future, a future without her. Ilara pressed her hand against the cold window. "Be happy," she whispered in her mind. "Please be happy, even if it's not with me." She turned to leave and slipped on the ice. The head hit the stone path hard. Blood began pooling in the white snow. And that's where our story takes its most dramatic turn. James felt it before anyone else noticed. He was sitting with Charlotte, barely listening to her endless chatter about her new dress, when suddenly he felt wrong, like part of his soul was in danger. "Excuse me," he said, standing up abruptly. "James?" Lady Margaret looked concerned. "Where are you going?" "I need some air, but it's snowing, and you can't." "I can manage." James grabbed his cane and headed for the door. Something was pulling him outside. He couldn't explain it. It was like an invisible rope was tied around his heart, dragging him toward the garden. He stepped out into the cold night air. Snow was falling heavily now, and the wind was getting stronger. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" No answer. But that feeling in his chest was getting stronger. Something was wrong, very wrong. He began walking carefully down the path, using his cane to guide him. His foot hit something soft. He knelt down and felt around in the snow. His hand touched fabric, then skin, cold skin. "Oh God," he whispered. "Help, help, someone's hurt." But the wind was too loud. No one inside the house could hear him. James felt along the person's body. Small frame, long hair, a familiar dress. "Ilara," he whispered. "Ilara." She was unconscious, bleeding from her head, her body growing cold in the snow. James tried to lift her, but he couldn't manage it alone. Not with his cane, not in the dark. "Stay with me," he begged, pulling off his coat to cover her. "Please, Ilara, stay with me." He held her head in his lap, trying to stop the bleeding with his hands. His own hands were freezing, but he didn't care. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to her still. "I should have fought harder for you. I should have told Mother that losing you was worse than losing my sight." The snow was falling harder now. James couldn't feel his fingers anymore, but he wouldn't let go of Ilara. "If you die," he told her, unconscious form, "I will die too. Do you understand me? I can't live in this world without you." That's when he made a decision that would change everything. James began to drag himself and Elara toward the house, inch by inch through the snow. He couldn't see where he was going. He couldn't feel his hands or feet, but he had to save her. James, Lady Margaret's voice came from somewhere behind him. James, what on earth? Oh my God. Finally, help arrived. Thomas and 2 other servants rushed out to carry Elara inside. The doctor was called immediately, but James collapsed right there in the snow. The cold, the exhaustion, the terror of almost losing Elara, it was too much. His body simply gave up. Both James and Elara lay unconscious in Whitmore Manor for 3 days. The doctor worked on Elara first. She has a severe concussion, he told Lady Margaret, and she's been exposed to the cold for too long. I'm not sure if she'll wake up. And my son, pneumonia. His lungs are filling with fluid. The next 24 hours will tell us everything. Lady Margaret sat between their 2 rooms, not knowing which way to turn. She had tried to keep them apart, and now she might lose them both. On the second night, James woke up first. Elara was the first word out of his mouth. Where is she? James. Thank God. Lady Margaret rushed to his bedside. You're awake. Where is Elara? He asked again, trying to sit up. She's in the room next door, James. She's very sick. I have to see her. You can't even stand. But James was already swinging his legs out of bed. He fell immediately, but he started crawling toward the door. James, stop! You'll hurt yourself. Then help me, James said firmly. Help me get to her, or I'll crawl there myself. Lady Margaret had never seen her son so determined. Even when he went off to war, he hadn't looked this fierce. All right, she said quietly. All right. She helped James to the next room, where Elara lay pale and still in the bed. Her head was bandaged, and her breathing was very shallow. James felt for her hand. When he found it, it was cold. Too cold. She's dying, isn't she? He asked. Lady Margaret couldn't lie to him. The doctor isn't hopeful. James squeezed Elara's hand. Elara, can you hear me? It's James, I'm right here. No response. I know you think you're protecting me by staying away, James continued. But you're wrong. Nothing in this world matters if you're not in it. Still nothing. James leaned closer to her ear. Remember when you taught me to shave myself? You guided my hand so carefully. Remember when you showed me where all the furniture was? You never let me bump into anything. He was crying now. You taught me that being blind doesn't mean being helpless. You showed me that love doesn't need words. You saved my life, Elara. Now let me save yours. Lady Margaret watched her son pour his heart out to the unconscious girl. She began to understand something she had missed before. This wasn't just attraction. This wasn't just loneliness. This was the kind of love that poets write about. The kind of love that changes everything. James, she said softly, if she wakes up, if she gets better, you have my blessing. James looked up in shock. Mother? I was wrong, Lady Margaret admitted. I thought I was protecting our family's reputation. But family isn't about reputation. It's about love. And that girl, she loves you more than her own life. James turned back to Elara. Did you hear that? He whispered. Mother says yes. We can be together, but you have to wake up first. As if she heard him, Elara's fingers moved slightly in his hand. Elara. James held his breath. Her eyes fluttered open. When she saw James beside her bed, tears began streaming down her face. Don't cry, James said, laughing and crying at the same time. You're safe. We're both safe. Elara tried to sit up, but she was too weak. Instead, she brought James's hand to her lips and kissed it softly. It was her way of saying, I'm never leaving you again. Spring came early to Whitmore Manor that year. Ilara recovered slowly but completely. The doctor said it was a miracle. Her will to live had been stronger than her injuries. James recovered too. Not just from his pneumonia, but from his anger and sadness. Having Ilara back gave him a reason to smile again. Lady Margaret kept her promise. She welcomed Ilara into the family like a daughter. She even started learning basic sign language so she could communicate with her future daughter-in-law. I want to apologize, Lady Margaret told Ilara one morning. I judged you unfairly. You're the best thing that ever happened to my son. Ilara hugged her warmly. Actions always spoke louder than words anyway. But James was planning something special. Something that would require all of his newfound confidence. On a beautiful morning in May, James asked Ilara to walk with him in the garden. The roses were blooming, and the air smelled like hope. Ilara, James said, as they sat on the stone bench where she used to bring him flowers, I need to ask you something important. Ilara squeezed his hand to show she was listening. I know I can't see your face, James continued. I know I can't give you all the things other men could give you. I can't drive you places or read to you or even see how beautiful you look in a wedding dress. Ilara placed her hand on his cheek. She shook her head. Those things didn't matter. But I can promise you this, James went on. I can promise to love you with every breath in my body. I can promise to listen to every word you don't say. I can promise to need you every single day for the rest of my life. James pulled out a small box from his pocket. His hands were shaking as he opened it. This was my grandmother's ring, he said. Mother gave it to me this morning. She said, Grandmother would have loved you. The ring was simple but beautiful. A single diamond surrounded by smaller stones that sparkled in the sunlight. Ilara rose, James said, getting down on one knee despite not being able to see her reaction. Will you marry me? Will you be my voice when I need words? Will you be my eyes when I need to see? Will you let me be your voice when the world needs to hear your heart? Ilara was crying so hard she couldn't breathe. She pulled James to his feet and kissed him with all the love she had stored up in her silent heart. When they finally broke apart, she took his hand and traced letters on his palm. Y-E-S. Y-E-S. James laughed and spun her around in his arms. She said yes, he shouted to the whole world. She said yes. From the house, Lady Margaret watched through the window and smiled. Finally, her son was truly home. The wedding was the most beautiful event Whitmore Manor had ever seen. Lady Margaret spared no expense. She filled the gardens with thousands of white roses and lilies. She hired the best musicians in England. She invited everyone from miles around. But the most beautiful part wasn't the decorations or the fancy food. It was the love that filled every corner of that place. Ilara wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit perfectly. Lady Margaret had insisted on hiring the finest seamstress in London. Every bride deserves to feel like a princess on her wedding day, Lady Margaret told Ilara as she helped her get ready. And you, my dear, are going to be the most beautiful princess anyone has ever seen. Ilara looked at herself in the mirror. The dress was made of ivory silk, with tiny pearls sewn into the bodice. The veil was made of the finest lace. She had never imagined she could look so elegant. But more than that, she had never imagined she could be so happy. James was nervous as he waited at the altar. He couldn't see the decorations or the guests, but he could feel the love in the air. "You look terrified," Thomas whispered. Thomas was James's best man, the same servant who had once been afraid to enter his room. "What if she changes her mind?" James whispered back. "What if she realizes she could do better?" Sir, Thomas said seriously, that girl walked through a blizzard just to make sure you were all right. She nearly died trying to see you one more time. She's not going anywhere. When the music started, James felt his heart stop. He knew Elara was walking down the aisle toward him. He wished more than anything that he could see her face. But then she was beside him, and he could smell her perfume, roses, just like always. He could feel her happiness radiating from her like warmth from a fire. The pastor began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of James Alexander Whitmore and Elara Rose Miller. When it came time for the vows, James spoke first. Elara, he said, his voice strong and clear, you found me when I was lost. You healed me when I was broken. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. I promised to spend every day of my life trying to deserve the gift of your love. Then it was Elara's turn. Of course, she couldn't speak her vows out loud, but Lady Margaret had helped her prepare something special. Elara took James's hands and began to trace her vows on his palms, just like she had traced her name that first day. I promise to be your voice when you need words. I promise to be your strength when you feel weak. I promise to love you in silence and in sound, in darkness and in light, in sickness and in health, for all the days of my life. James felt every word as if it were written on his heart. When the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," James cupped Elara's face in his hands. "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered. Their kiss was soft, gentle, and full of promise. And when they broke apart, every single person in that garden was crying happy tears. 6 months after their wedding, Elara had a surprise for James. She had been feeling sick in the mornings and tired during the day. At first, she thought she was just working too hard around the house. But when her symptoms continued, Lady Margaret insisted she see the doctor. The news was the most wonderful surprise of all. "How do I tell him?" Elara asked Lady Margaret in sign language after the doctor left. "However you want to, my dear," Lady Margaret smiled. "But I think he's going to be the happiest man in England." That evening, Elara led James to their favorite spot in the garden. It was a warm October evening, and the last roses of the season were still blooming. "You seem excited about something," James said, sitting beside her on their bench. "Your footsteps have been light all day." Elara took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. James looked confused. "Elara, what are you—" Then understanding dawned on his face. His eyes grew wide with wonder. Are we? He couldn't finish the sentence. Elara squeezed his hand once. "Yes." James let out a whoop of joy that could be heard all the way back at the house. He picked Elara up and spun her around, then set her down gently as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he whispered. "We're having a baby." He knelt down and pressed his ear to her stomach. "Hello in there, little one," he said softly. "This is your daddy. I can't wait to meet you." Elara ran her fingers through his hair, watching his face light up with pure joy. This man who had once thought his life was over was now planning a future filled with hope. "I love you," James said, looking up at her. "I love you so much I think I might explode." Elara laughed silently and helped him to his feet. Then she took his face in her hands and kissed him with all the love in her heart. They were going to be a family. A real family, built on love, not duty or expectations. It was everything either of them had ever dreamed of. But even the greatest love stories face their darkest hours. When Elara was 7 months pregnant, the Spanish flu arrived in their village. It started small. A few people in town getting sick, but within weeks it was spreading like wildfire. Entire families were dying. The local doctor was overwhelmed. "We need to leave," Lady Margaret told James urgently. Go to the house in Scotland until this passes. We can't leave, James replied. These people need help. Elara has been making medicine for the sick families. We can't abandon them now. It was true. Elara had learned about healing herbs from her mother. When people in the village started getting sick, she immediately started preparing remedies and taking them to families who couldn't afford a doctor. James, think about the baby, Lady Margaret pleaded. I am thinking about the baby, James said firmly. I'm thinking about the world I want our child to grow up in. A world where people help each other, not a world where the rich run away when the poor need them. So they stayed. Elara continued making her medicines, and James helped deliver them. Even though he couldn't see, he knew every path in the village by heart. But fate is cruel sometimes. One morning in February, Elara woke up feeling terrible. Not just tired, really sick, fever, chills, the awful cough that meant the flu had finally reached their house. No, James said when he felt how hot her forehead was. No, not you, not now. Elara tried to get out of bed to make breakfast, but she collapsed immediately. James caught her just before she hit the floor. Mother! James shouted. Mother! Get the doctor! Now! But they both knew the truth. The doctor was sick too. Half the village was dead or dying. There was no help coming. James carried Elara back to bed and sent a servant racing to the next town for medicine. But deep in his heart, he knew it might be too late. The baby was due in 6 weeks. If Elara died now, James refused to think about it. He sat beside her bed, holding her hand, telling her stories about their future together. Remember, he whispered as she drifted in and out of consciousness, we're going to teach our baby to ride horses. You're going to show them the secret spots in the garden where the best flowers grow. I'm going to teach them to be brave. Elara squeezed his hand weakly. She was fighting, but the fever was winning. On the 3rd night, she went into labor. The baby was coming 6 weeks early in the middle of a flu pandemic with no doctor available. Lady Margaret had delivered babies before. It was common for wealthy women to help during emergencies. But this was her daughter-in-law, and the circumstances were terrifying. James, you need to leave the room, Lady Margaret said as Elara's contractions began. No, James said firmly, I'm staying with my wife. This isn't proper. Nothing about our love has been proper, James snapped. And I'm not leaving her now. Elara reached for James's hand. Even in her pain and fever, she wanted him there. The labor was long and difficult. Elara was weak from the flu, and the baby was early. Several times, Lady Margaret thought they were going to lose both mother and child. But Elara was a fighter. She had survived poverty, prejudice, and a head injury that should have killed her. She wasn't going to give up now. At dawn on February 18, 1919, their daughter was born. She was tiny. So tiny, she fit in James's 2 hands. But she was alive, and she was perfect. Is she? James asked, holding his breath. The baby let out a strong, healthy cry that filled the room with hope. She's beautiful, Lady Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. She has your eyes, James, and Elara's dark hair. James held his daughter for the first time, this tiny miracle who had come into the world against all odds. Hello, little one, he whispered. I'm your daddy, and that brave, wonderful woman over there is your mama. But when he looked toward the bed, his heart stopped. Elara was unconscious. Her breathing was shallow, and her fever was worse than ever. Mother, James said quietly, is she? She's alive, Lady Margaret said. But James, she's very weak. The birth took everything she had left. James handed the baby to his mother and knelt beside Elara's bed. You did it, he whispered to her. Our daughter is here, and she's perfect, but I need you to stay with us. Please, Ilara, fight a little longer." For 3 days, Ilara drifted between life and death. James never left her side. He held her hand, talked to her, begged her to come back to them. The baby was healthy, thank God. She was small but strong, just like her mother. "What should we name her?" Lady Margaret asked on the 3rd day. James looked at his unconscious wife. "Hope," he said. "Her name is Hope, because that's what Ilara gave me when I thought my life was over." On the 4th morning, Ilara's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes and saw James sleeping in the chair beside her bed, holding their daughter against his chest. She reached out and touched his face. James woke immediately. "Ilara, oh, thank God you're awake." She smiled weakly and pointed to the baby. "She's perfect," James said, placing Hope in Ilara's arms, just like her mother. Ilara looked down at her daughter and began to cry. Happy tears this time. They had all survived. Against every odd, their little family was complete. Spring, 1939. 20 years have passed since that terrible winter. James sits in his favorite chair in the garden, now 50 years old, but still handsome. His hair is silver at the temples, and there are laugh lines around his eyes. Ilara, now 42, is still as beautiful as ever. She's working in her rose garden, the same roses she brought to James during his darkest days. And Hope is 20 years old now, the image of her mother, but with her father's blue eyes. She's home from university, full of stories and dreams. "Tell me again how you and Mama met," Hope says, settling on the grass beside James's chair. James smiles. This is Hope's favorite story, and she's heard it 100 times. "Well," James begins, "it was during the Great War. I came home broken and angry, thinking my life was over." As James tells their story, Ilara stops her gardening to listen. Even after all these years, she loves hearing him talk about their early days together. Hope has grown up bilingual. She speaks perfect English out loud and perfect sign language with her mother. She's never thought it was strange that her mother doesn't speak. To Hope, love has always been about actions, not words. "The best part," James continues, "is that your mother taught me something very important. She taught me that being blind doesn't mean you can't see what really matters. And what really matters is love." "Are you going to tell her about the letters?" Ilara asks in sign language. James grins. "Should I?" "What letters?" Hope asks, looking between her parents. James reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out a small, worn bundle of papers. "These," he says, "are love letters your mother wrote to me." Hope looks confused. "But Mama can't write, can she?" "She learned," James explains. "After we were married, she spent 2 years secretly learning to write. Then she started leaving me little notes around the house. Love letters I could read with my fingers." He hands Hope one of the letters. It's written in simple block letters, easy to read by touch. "My dear James, you are the sunshine in my silent world. I love you more today than yesterday. Your Ilara." Hope's eyes fill with tears. "Mama, this is so beautiful." Ilara comes over and sits on the arm of James's chair. He reaches up and takes her hand, a gesture as natural as breathing after all these years. "The war is starting again," Hope says quietly. "In Europe. Will you have to go back, Papa?" "No," James says firmly. "My fighting days are over. My job now is to love your mother and watch you change the world." "Me? Change the world?" "Of course." James smiles. "You're going to be a doctor, remember? You're going to help people the way your mother helped me." Hope beams. She's been accepted to medical school, the first woman in their village to even try. I learned from the best, Hope says, looking at Elara. Mama always said healing comes from the heart, not from textbooks. As the sun sets over Whitmore Manor, the three of them sit together in comfortable silence. James holds Elara's hand. Hope leans against her mother's shoulder. They've survived war, disease, prejudice, and loss. They've built a love that defied every rule and expectation of their time. And they've proven something that storytellers have known for thousands of years. True love always finds a way. James, Elara writes on a piece of paper and shows it to him by guiding his fingers over the letters. Do you ever regret losing your sight? James considers the question seriously. Then he smiles. Never, he says, because losing my sight helped me find you. And finding you gave me everything that matters. Elara kisses his cheek and writes one more note. I love you too, forever and always. As night falls over Whitmore Manor, their love story continues. Not the dramatic, desperate love of their youth, but the deep, steady love of two souls who chose each other every single day for 20 years. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, they say you can still hear James reading Elara's love letters aloud in the garden, his voice carrying across the roses that bloom there still. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Elara who lived with a family that didn't understand her. This is her story about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can turn out to be the best thing ever. It was a Tuesday morning when a man on a horse came riding up to the Valbuena family's house. He was carrying a very important letter, and he had a mean smile on his face. Everyone in town knew what this letter was about, and they were all waiting to see what would happen. The man on the horse gave the letter to Don Carmelo, who was the father of the family. Don Carmelo was like the king of his house. Everyone had to do what he said. When he opened the letter, his eyes got very wide with surprise and excitement. The letter was from Don Arturo de Mendoza, a very rich and important man who lived far away. Don Arturo owned more land than anyone else, for miles and miles around. He was known as a good man who worked hard and was always fair to people. Any family would be happy to have him marry one of their daughters. But here's the strange part. Don Arturo didn't ask to marry just any daughter. He asked specifically for Elara, the youngest daughter of the family. Don Carmelo called his wife Doña Leonor and his two older daughters into the living room. The two older daughters were named Inés and Beatriz. Inés was 26 years old and Beatriz was 24. Both of them were very beautiful and had been taught all the things that rich ladies were supposed to know, like how to sit properly, how to speak nicely, and how to run a big house. Read this, said Don Carmelo, giving the letter to his wife with a smile that looked happy but felt mean. Doña Leonor started reading the letter out loud. As she read, her smile got bigger and bigger, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile people have when they're planning something mean. When she got to the part where Don Arturo asked for Elara to be his wife, the whole room got very quiet. Then Inés started laughing, but not happy laughing. It was mean, cruel laughing. Soon Beatriz was laughing too, and then the parents joined in. He asked for Elara. Doña Leonor said, like she couldn't believe it, the richest and most important man in the whole area wants to marry our Elara. This is perfect, said Don Carmelo, clapping his hands together. Just perfect. While all this was happening, Elara wasn't in the room. She was in the back of the house taking care of her sick grandmother like she did every single day. Her grandmother was very old and couldn't get out of bed anymore, so Elara would bring her food, give her medicine and put cool cloths on her forehead when she had a fever. Even though Elara wasn't in the room, She could hear the mean laughing coming from the front of the house. She had heard her family laugh at her many times before, but this sounded different. This sounded like they were planning something really bad. To understand why her family was laughing so meanly, you need to know about Elara and why her family thought she was a problem. Elara was 23 years old, and she was different from her sisters in many ways. While Inez and Beatriz were quiet and always did what they were told, Elara had a big heart and couldn't stand to see people being treated unfairly. 3 years before this story, Elara found out that the town judge was taking money from bad people to help them steal land from poor families. Instead of staying quiet like her family wanted her to, Elara collected proof of what the judge was doing and gave it to the government officials who could stop him. When the judge got in trouble, it also got Elara's family in trouble because they had been working with the judge to make money in dishonest ways. Don Carmelo was so angry at Elara that he didn't speak to her for months. The next year, Elara discovered that some store owners were making food cost way too much money during a time when there wasn't enough rain and crops weren't growing well. Poor families couldn't afford to buy food for their children. Again, Elara couldn't just watch this happen. She told the authorities, and the dishonest store owners got in trouble. But guess what? Elara's family was secretly making money from those high prices too. So once again, Elara's honesty cost her family money, and they got even angrier at her. This kept happening over and over. Every time Elara saw something wrong, she tried to fix it, even when it caused problems for her own family. To the Valbuenas, who made their money by being dishonest and tricky, having a daughter with such a strong sense of right and wrong was like having a constant headache. But there was another reason why her family thought Elara would be a bad wife for an important man like Don Arturo. While her sisters were very pretty in a delicate way, with soft hands and perfect hair, Elara looked different. She was stronger looking, with hands that were rough from hard work and a face that showed she was determined and brave. Her family thought this made her ugly and unsuitable for marriage. They couldn't see that Elara's strength came from her good character, that her rough hands meant she wasn't afraid of honest work, and that her determined expressions showed she would never give up on doing what was right. What they didn't know was that 5 years earlier, Don Arturo had seen Elara do something that made him fall in love with who she really was, and her family was about to make the biggest mistake of their lives by not understanding how special she was. 5 years before the letter arrived, there was a busy market day in the town of San Roque. It was Saturday morning, and the market was full of people buying and selling things. You could hear merchants shouting about their prices, children running around playing, and smell fresh bread and spices in the air. Don Arturo had come to the market early to buy things he needed for his farm, but he ended up staying much longer because of something amazing he saw happen. Near one of the stalls, 3 young ladies were looking at pretty lace fabric. 2 of them, clearly sisters, were examining the lace very carefully, the way rich people do when they're shopping. Their dresses were beautiful, their hair was perfect, and they acted like they had been taught perfect manners. They were exactly the kind of young ladies any man would expect to find in a good family. The 3rd young woman looked very different. While her sisters argued about the quality of the lace, she kept looking around like she was searching for something. Her clothes were nice, but much simpler than her sisters'. Her hands looked like they knew what hard work was. Then Don Arturo heard shouting that changed everything. Across the market square, near where they sold animals, a fight had started. A short, fat merchant was yelling at a thin, old man, saying the old man was trying to steal one of his chickens. The old man was very scared and was trying to explain that he had only touched the chicken to see if it was healthy before he decided whether to buy it. "You dirty thief!" the merchant shouted, making sure everyone could hear him. "Trying to steal my chickens right in front of everyone. The old man had tears in his eyes and was asking people to believe his story. His clothes were old and full of holes, and he had no shoes on his feet. Anyone could see that he was very poor. It was clear that he barely had enough money to buy food, let alone steal chickens in the middle of a crowded market. Don Arturo watched this happening and felt very angry. He knew that merchant Antonio Ferrer, and he knew Antonio was dishonest and liked to pick on poor people. It was obvious that Antonio was lying about the old man, probably to scare other poor people so they wouldn't try to ask for lower prices. Don Arturo was about to step in and help the old man, but before he could, someone else stepped forward. The third young woman from the fabric stall had left her sisters and was walking straight toward the fight. She walked with confidence, her shoulders back, and there was something about the way she moved that made people step aside to let her through. "Stop this right now," she said, standing between the merchant and the old man. Her voice was clear and strong, and it had the kind of authority that made Antonio stop shouting for a moment. "And who are you to tell me what to do, young lady?" Antonio growled, but Don Arturo could hear that the merchant was a little bit scared. "I'm someone who has been watching your stall for 10 minutes and saw exactly what happened," the young woman said, crossing her arms. "This man touched the chicken for 3 seconds to check if it was healthy, asked you how much it cost, and when you told him it was twice what it should cost, he said thank you and walked away. He never tried to take anything." The crowd of people watching started talking to each other. Several people said they had also seen what happened, and that the young woman was telling the truth. Antonio realized he was in trouble. "You didn't see anything," he said, "but he was lying. You're just trying to help this thief." Then the young woman did something that made Don Arturo's heart feel like it was going to burst with admiration. She took a small bag of money from her dress, counted out some coins, and held them out to the merchant. "How much does the chicken cost?" she asked calmly. "2 reales," Antonio said, confused about why she was asking. "Here are 2 reals," she said, putting the coins in his hand. "Now the chicken belongs to me." She turned to the old man and gave him the chicken. "This is for you, sir, for your family." The old man was so shocked he could barely speak. He tried to give the chicken back, saying he couldn't accept such a gift, but the young woman insisted with such kindness that he finally took it, with tears running down his face. "But I can't take this, miss," he said. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to know you to know that you're an honest person," she replied, smiling for the first time since Don Arturo had been watching. "And I can see that you have a family waiting at home who needs food." As the old man walked away, holding the chicken like it was the most precious thing in the world, Don Arturo saw the young woman's 2 sisters come over to her. They looked embarrassed and angry. "Elara, what have you done now?" the older sister asked, her voice full of disapproval. "I did what was right," Elara answered, wiping her hands on her dress. "You spent the family's money on a complete stranger," the other sister said. "Father is going to be furious." "Then I'll explain it to him," Elara said with a calmness that impressed Don Arturo even more. Her sisters dragged her away, complaining about how she always caused trouble and how she always behaved inappropriately. But Don Arturo kept watching as they walked away, noticing how Elara held her head high and didn't seem sorry at all for what she had done. At that moment, something wonderful happened in Don Arturo's heart. He had just seen something very rare. A person who did what was right, no matter what it cost her. A person who saw someone else's suffering and couldn't just ignore it. He quietly asked some people he knew about the young women and learned they were from the Valbuena family. The 2 older sisters were Inés and Beatriz, known for being beautiful and well-educated. The youngest was Elara, and people had very different opinions about her. Some people said she was trouble. that she was stubborn and stuck her nose into things that weren't her business. But other people, especially the poorer people in town, spoke about her with love and gratitude. They told stories of small acts of kindness she had done without expecting anything in return. Don Arturo knew which version was true, and from that day on, Elara de Valbuena never left his thoughts. Back in the Valbuena family's living room, the mean planning continued with the precision of people who had practiced being cruel. Don Carmelo walked back and forth with his hands behind his back, his mean smile getting bigger. Doña Leonor sat reading the letter again and again, like she needed to make sure she wasn't dreaming about this opportunity. "Perfect," Don Carmelo said, stopping suddenly. "5 years we've been dealing with the problems this girl causes us, and now a man appears asking specifically for her." Inez played with her blonde hair. "Father, do you think he knows about her incidents?" "Impossible," Doña Leonor said with confidence. "Don Arturo de Mendoza lives 2 towns away. If he knew about her reputation, he would never make this request." Beatriz stood up and went to the window, looking at Elara, who was hanging clothes outside to dry. "Look at her, always working, always serious. No man here has wanted to marry her. Obviously this stranger doesn't know what he's getting himself into. And that's exactly what makes this situation so perfect," Don Carmelo said, hitting the table with satisfaction. "He's expecting to receive a proper, educated, obedient wife. Imagine his surprise when he discovers he's chosen our Elara." The cruelness of their plan was simple and mean. They would write back to Don Arturo saying yes to the marriage, but they wouldn't tell him anything about what Ella was really like. They would let the man discover for himself that he had asked for the hand of the most troublesome daughter in the family. By the time he discovers what kind of woman she really is, Don Carmelo continued, it will be too late. The wedding will have already happened, and she'll be his problem, not ours. Doña Leonor folded the letter carefully. "And best of all, she'll be far enough away that she can't interfere with our business anymore. 2 towns away is a blessing." What they didn't know was that, outside the living room, Elara had stopped hanging up clothes and was leaning against the wall listening to every word of their conversation. Her heart was beating so loudly she was afraid someone might hear it. Her family's words echoed in her mind like stones thrown into calm water. "His problem, not ours. Too late. A blessing." That's how they saw her, like a burden to be sent away to the first man willing to take her. Elara closed her eyes and put her forehead against the cold wood of the wall. For 23 years, she had tried to earn her family's love and respect. She had taken care of her sick grandmother, done the hardest chores around the house, and tried to be a good daughter, but none of it mattered, because she had committed the unforgivable crime of having a conscience. Every time she exposed something wrong, every time she stood up for someone who couldn't defend themselves, every time she refused to participate in her family's dishonest schemes, she had dug her social grave a little deeper, and now they had finally found a way to get rid of her permanently. The tears she had been holding back for years finally started to flow down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of painful understanding. She finally realized that she would never be loved by these people, no matter what she did. To them, she would always be the family's mistake, the daughter who was born wrong. But as she wiped her tears with the back of her hand, Elara made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to get rid of her so badly, if they thought sending her to a stranger was fitting punishment, then she would turn their plan into her victory. She would not go to this wedding as a victim. She would go as a woman who finally understood her own worth, regardless of her family's opinion. If Don Arturo de Mendoza discovered who she really was and decided to reject her, at least she would have the dignity of not having lied about her nature. While the Valbuena family was plotting what they thought was revenge, 40 kilometers away, Don Arturo de Mendoza was dealing with a completely different problem. Sitting on his porch at sunset, watching his cattle graze in the green fields of his property, he had been holding a blank piece of paper for over an hour, trying to find the right words to write to Elara's family. This wasn't the first time Don Arturo had thought about marriage. At 32 years old, he had built more than most men achieve in a whole lifetime. His farm was successful, his businesses were respected, and he had enough money to support a large family. But whenever he thought about marriage, the image that came to his mind wasn't just any beautiful, well-educated woman from the area. It was always Ella. For 5 years, he had carried the memory of that afternoon at the market like a man carries a burning flame in his chest. Not a week had gone by without him thinking about her, wondering what kind of woman she had become, if she still had that same brave spirit that had impressed him so much. Don Arturo had quietly learned about the Valbuena family over the years. He found out about Don Carmelo's dishonest business dealings, about Inez's and Beatrice's attempts to marry rich men, and most importantly, about Elara's constant interference in local corruption schemes. For any other man, such information would be a reason to avoid the family altogether. For Don Arturo, it was confirmation that Elara was exactly who he thought she was, a woman of integrity living in a family that neither understood nor valued her integrity. He knew that asking specifically for Elara would raise suspicions. Social rules said he should choose one of the older sisters, who were more beautiful and more suitable for a man of his position. But Don Arturo had learned not to trust social rules when they conflicted with what his heart told him. The truth was that he didn't want a decorative wife. He didn't want someone who would just agree with him, who would only keep the house clean and the children fed. Don Arturo wanted a true partner, someone he could share not only his bed and his meals with, but also his values, his dreams, and his concerns about what was right and wrong in the world. And Elara, from what he had observed and learned, was the only woman he knew who had those qualities. Finally, he dipped his pen in the ink and began to write. His words were carefully chosen, respectful but direct. He introduced himself properly, mentioned his property and financial situation, and then made the request that he knew would shock the family. He wanted to ask for Doña Elara de Valbuena's hand in marriage. He didn't mention his true reasons. He didn't talk about the market, his admiration for her courage, or the 5 years he had spent thinking about her. That would be inappropriate in a formal letter, but he wrote honestly about his desire to find a companion who valued honesty and integrity as much as he did. When he finished the letter, Don Arturo read it again. He knew he was taking an enormous risk. Elara could have changed completely in the last 5 years. She could have become bitter or resentful because of the conflicts with her family. She could even reject him completely. But something inside him insisted it was worth trying. The next morning he took the letter to the post office himself, personally giving it to the postal worker and paying extra to make sure it would arrive quickly. Then he went home and tried to stay busy with work around the farm, but his thoughts kept returning to that letter traveling along the dusty road toward Elara's town. 3 days later, the reply arrived. Don Arturo immediately recognized the masculine handwriting on the envelope, obviously written by Don Carmelo de Valbuena, as was proper, but when he opened it and read the contents, something about how quickly they had accepted made him slightly uneasy. The letter was polite but too brief. Don Carmelo accepted the request with enthusiasm, confirmed that Elara was eager to meet her future husband, and suggested that Don Arturo travel the following Monday so they could get to know each other before the wedding. Don Arturo frowned. There was something in the tone of the letter that didn't sound entirely natural. It was almost as if the family was overly anxious to close the deal, as if they wanted to send Elara away as quickly as possible. He wondered if there was something he didn't know about her, a health problem perhaps, or a recent scandal the family wanted to hide. But then he remembered the woman he had seen defending a stranger in the market, and decided he would face whatever problems arose. On Monday, Elara would arrive, and then he would finally discover if the 5 years of hoping had been worth it. Monday arrived with a grey sky that seemed to perfectly match the mood in the Valbuena household. Elara woke up before dawn, as she had for the past 5 days, unable to sleep deeply, knowing that her life was about to change completely. She had spent the previous week in quiet preparation. She packed her few belongings into a small worn trunk that had belonged to her grandmother. She didn't own many dresses. Her family had never invested in her wardrobe the way they did for her sisters, but she made sure every item was clean and carefully ironed. More important than the clothes, Elara had spent hours thinking about how she would present herself to Don Arturo de Mendoza. She had made the decision to be completely honest about who she was, but that didn't mean she wasn't afraid. What if he rejected her? What if, after really getting to know her, he decided that her family was right, that she was too much trouble? But every time those thoughts attacked her, Elara remembered something important. She would rather be rejected for being herself than accepted for being a lie. She had lived 23 years trying to fit her family's expectations, and it had only made her unhappy. She wouldn't make the same mistake with her husband. Downstairs, breakfast was served in silence. Don Carmelo and Doña Leonor exchanged satisfied glances, while Inés and Beatriz could barely hide their joy at finally seeing Elara leave. The only person who seemed genuinely sad was her grandmother, who held Elara's hand with shaking fingers. "You will be happy, my child," the old woman whispered. Her words were filled with a hope that Elara didn't sense from the other family members. "You have a good heart. That always finds its place in the world." Elara kissed her grandmother's forehead, feeling tears sting her eyes. She was the only person in that house she would truly miss. The carriage that would take Elara to Don Arturo's farm arrived exactly at 8:00 in the morning. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind expression, helped her load the trunk and opened the door for her with a respectful bow. "Have a good trip, my daughter," said Don Carmelo, kissing her cheek in a show of affection that Elara knew was purely for show. "We hope you will be very happy in your new life," added Doña Leonor, though her tone suggested she neither expected nor really wanted to receive letters from Elara. Inés and Beatriz waved from the porch, their smiles too bright to be sincere. Elara climbed into the carriage without looking back, knowing that if she did, she might lose the courage to leave. The trip to Don Arturo's farm would take about 4 hours, passing through dirt roads that wound between hills and crop fields. Elara used the time to organize her thoughts and mentally prepare for the meeting that would define her future. She had thought a lot about what she knew of Don Arturo de Mendoza. From the comments she had heard over the years, he was known as a fair, hard-working and successful man. He had never married, which at 32 years old was considered unusual, but not necessarily problematic. Some men preferred to wait until they were fully established before starting a family. What intrigued Elara most was the fact that he had asked specifically for her. Her sisters were obviously more beautiful, better educated in feminine arts, more suitable for a prestigious marriage. Why would a successful man choose precisely the daughter her own family considered problematic? There were two possibilities. Either he didn't know about her reputation and would be unpleasantly surprised when he got to know her better, or he knew exactly who she was and had his own reasons for wanting her as his wife. Elara couldn't decide which of the two options made her more nervous. As the carriage approached its destination, the scenery began to change. The properties became larger and better maintained, the fields more organized, the livestock visibly healthier. It was obvious they were entering a region of real prosperity, not the questionable prosperity that characterized her family's businesses. Finally, the driver announced that they had arrived at the Mendoza farm. Elara looked out the carriage window and felt breathless for a moment. The property was impressive, not showy, but solid and well-planned. The main house was large enough to house a big family, built of good wood, with a large porch that invited relaxation. The stables and barns were organized functionally, and everywhere there were signs that this place was run by someone who really understood farming. But what caught Elara's attention most was the man who came out of the house to greet her. Don Arturo de Mendoza was taller than she remembered, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical work. His dark hair had some grey streaks, and his face showed the marks of someone who spent a lot of time in the sun. But it was his eyes that made her recognize him immediately. The same attentive and intelligent eyes that had watched her in the market 5 years before. He had been watching her that day. She was sure of it now. The way he looked at her as the driver helped her out of the carriage was not the look of a man seeing a stranger for the first time. It was the look of someone who recognized her. Doña Elara Arturo said, approaching with measured steps. His voice was deep and calm, filled with a gentleness that made something move in her chest. "Welcome to the Mendoza farm." "Don Arturo," she responded, making a small bow. "Thank you for having me." He took her trunk from the driver's hands and gestured toward the house. "You must be tired from the trip. How about we go inside to talk more comfortably?" As they walked side by side toward the porch, Elara felt a strange mix of nervousness and relief. There was something about Don Arturo's presence that calmed her. He didn't seem like the kind of man who would make quick judgments or expect her to be someone she wasn't. The living room of Don Arturo's house was simple but cozy. Solid wood furniture, some books scattered on a side table, and a fireplace that gave off gentle warmth. Elara sat in a comfortable chair, trying to hide the nervousness that was growing in her chest. Don Arturo served coffee in delicate porcelain cups, a touch of refinement she hadn't expected. "How was the trip?" he asked, sitting on the sofa across from her. There was a respectful distance between them, but Elara noticed he was watching her carefully, as if trying to understand something in her expression. "Comfortable, thank you," she replied, holding the cup in her hands. The warmth of the porcelain helped keep her hands busy. "Your property is beautiful. It must have taken years to build all this." 10 years of constant work," said Don Arturo with quiet pride. "I bought the land when it was nothing more than abandoned pasture. Each corral, each fence, each plantation was planned and built little by little." Elara nodded, impressed. She knew the value of hard work and could recognize its results when she saw them. "It must be satisfying to see all this grow with your own hands," she said. "It is," he agreed. "But a property this size calls out for a family. An empty house, no matter how big, is still just an empty house." There was a moment of silence as they both drank their coffee. Elara knew the time had come for serious conversations, the questions that would determine whether this meeting would lead to a wedding or a polite goodbye. Don Arturo was the first to speak, placing his cup back on the saucer. "I need to ask you a direct question," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Please do," Elara replied. "Why did you ask for me specifically?" "My sisters are more beautiful, better educated in the arts expected of a wife. Any sensible man would choose one of them." Don Arturo was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Elara saw something change in his expression. A decision being made. "Can I be equally direct?" he asked. "Please. Because I saw you in a market 5 years ago. I saw what you did for an old man who was being falsely accused of theft. I saw how you spent your own money to buy a chicken and give it to him without expecting anything in return. Don Arturo leaned forward even more. I don't want a pretty and silent wife. I want a partner who has the moral strength to do what's right, even when it's difficult. His words struck Elara like lightning. All her life, her family had criticized her for exactly the qualities that Don Arturo was praising. It was as if the world had turned upside down. But you should know, she said, finding the courage to remain honest, that my family considers me problematic. They sent me here because they want to get rid of me, not because they think I would make a good wife for you. I suspected as much, Don Arturo answered calmly. The speed with which they accepted my request was telling. And even knowing that, you still want to marry me? Don Arturo stood up and walked to the window, looking at the fields that stretched beyond the house. Yes, he said. Can I tell you something about myself? Of course. I could have married any of a dozen women in the last 10 years. All beautiful, all from respectable families, all would have been sensible choices. He turned to look at her, but every time I considered marriage, I thought of that girl in the market who defended a stranger, and no other woman could compare to that memory. Elara felt tears sting her eyes. You don't really know me. I might disappoint you, or you might be exactly what my life needs, he said, sitting back down. Elara, can I make you a proposal? What kind of proposal? That we spend a few weeks truly getting to know each other, without pressure, without impossible expectations. If at the end of that time we discover we're compatible, we'll get married. If not, I'll help you find a suitable situation, either returning to your family or finding another arrangement that makes you happy. The generosity of the offer left Elara speechless. You would do that even if I decided not to marry you? I would do it because a woman of your character deserves to have choices in life, not just be pushed from one unhappy situation to another. For the first time in years, Elara felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Hope that perhaps there was a place in the world where she could be accepted exactly as she was. And if I accept this proposal, she said slowly, you promise I can be completely honest about who I am, even if some things about me make you uncomfortable. Especially then. Don Arturo responded, lies and appearances are a terrible foundation for any relationship, much less for a marriage. Elara took a deep breath. Then I accept your proposal, but with one condition. Which one? That you also be completely honest with me about your expectations, your fears, your dreams. If we're going to truly know each other, it has to work both ways. Don Arturo smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since she arrived. Deal, he said. They shook hands to seal the agreement, and Elara felt an electric current run through her arm at the contact with him. There was something about this man that made her feel safe and challenged at the same time, like he could handle her strength without trying to diminish it. The following weeks passed like a dream for Elara. Each morning brought new discoveries about life on the farm, about Don Arturo, and surprisingly, about herself. For the first time in her life, she found herself in an environment where her opinions were not only tolerated, but actively sought out. Don Arturo kept his promise of total honesty. During their walks around the property, he shared his plans to expand the cattle business, his dreams of building a school for the workers' children, and his concerns about the droughts that occasionally affected the region. Elara discovered she had valuable ideas about farm management, ideas that came from her natural powers of observation and her concern for people's well-being. What if we built a system of connected water tanks? She suggested one afternoon while they were watching workers carry water for the livestock. That way, even during droughts, we would have enough reserves. Don Arturo stopped walking and looked at her with admiration. That's brilliant. Why didn't I think of that before? Because you think like a man who has always had resources, Ilara answered honestly. I think like someone who grew up seeing people suffer from lack of planning. It was this type of exchange that made Don Arturo's heart beat faster. Ilara not only had an admirable sense of justice, but also practical intelligence that perfectly complemented his own abilities. She saw angles he overlooked, questioned decisions he made automatically, and always with the goal of improving the lives of the people around them. But it wasn't just the practical aspects of life that brought them together. Tell me about your family, Don Arturo asked her one afternoon. Zara hesitated for a moment, but then decided to keep her promise of complete honesty. They see me as a mistake, as someone who was born with flaws they can't fix. What kind of flaws? I worry too much about strangers. I ask uncomfortable questions. I can't pretend I don't see injustices. Ilara looked at her hands. My mother always said a lady should be like a beautiful doll, seen but not heard. Don Arturo was quiet for a long moment. And what do you think about that? I think a life without purpose isn't worth living. If you have the ability to help someone or improve a situation, how can you just ignore it? Do you know what the difference is between you and your sisters? Don Arturo said with conviction. They are beautiful. You are transformative. Beauty fades with time, but the ability to change lives, to transform a community, that's infinitely more valuable. His words touched something deep in Ilara's soul. For the first time, someone not only accepted her most problematic characteristics but saw them as virtues. As the days passed, the attraction between them grew naturally and intensely. It wasn't just mutual respect or intellectual compatibility. There was a physical chemistry that showed itself in lingering glances, in casual touches that seemed to last longer than necessary, in the way Ilara's heart raced when Don Arturo smiled at her. One night, while they were walking through the garden under starlight, Don Arturo suddenly stopped. Ilara, I need to tell you something. What is it? I hadn't planned for this to happen so quickly, but he took a deep breath. I'm falling in love with you, not with the idea of you that I had in my head for 5 years, but with the real woman that you are. Ilara's heart felt like it was going to explode in her chest. Arturo, I know we promised to just get to know each other without pressure, and I'll keep that promise. If you need more time, or if you decide you don't feel the same way. I feel the same way, she interrupted, her voice coming out as a whisper. I'm also falling in love with your kindness, your honesty, the way you make me feel like I can be myself without fear. Don Arturo approached, raising his hand to gently touch her face. Can I kiss you? In response, Ilara stood on her tiptoes, meeting his lips with hers. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but then deepened with an intensity that made them both tremble. When they separated, they stood embraced under the stars, feeling that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer two strangers testing a possibility. They were two people who had found something rare and precious in each other. Marry me, Don Arturo whispered against her hair. Not because it was an arrangement between our families, but because I can't imagine my life without you. Yes, Ilara answered without hesitation. Yes, I want to marry you. Ilara and Arturo's wedding took place on a sunny Saturday morning in the small church of the neighboring village. The ceremony was simple but full of emotion that moved everyone present. Ilara wore a dress that Don Arturo had made especially for her, not flashy but elegant, in a shade of blue that highlighted her eyes. The Valbuena family did not attend. They sent only a cold letter congratulating the couple and wishing them good luck in their marriage. Ilara read the letter on the morning of the wedding and threw it in the fireplace without showing any emotion. That family belonged to her past. Her new life was beginning. Don Arturo, on the other hand, had invited all the workers on the farm and their families, friends from other properties, and even some humble people from town whom Elara had helped over the years. The church was full of people who really loved them and wanted their happiness. During the ceremony, when Don Arturo took Elara's hands and promised to love, protect and respect her for life, she saw tears of emotion in his eyes, and when she made her promises to be his loyal companion, his honest advisor, and his best friend forever, her voice came out firm and clear, without any hesitation. The party after the wedding was memorable. The guests danced until late, ate the abundant food prepared by the women of the region, and celebrated a union that everyone could see was based on true love. Elara had never felt so surrounded by love and acceptance. But the real surprise came 3 months later, when Don Carmelo de Valbuena unexpectedly appeared at the farm. Elara was in the garden, picking flowers to decorate the dinner table, when she saw the family carriage coming up the road. Her first impulse was panic. What could her family want now? But then she remembered that she was no longer the rejected and vulnerable daughter. She was Doña Elara de Mendoza, mistress of her own house, married to a man who respected her, living the life she had chosen. Don Arturo came out of the house when he heard the noise of the carriage, naturally positioning himself next to his wife. His presence was a silent reminder that Elara was no longer alone in facing her family. Don Carmelo stepped out of the carriage with an expression Elara had never seen before, a mixture of discomfort and something that seemed almost like respect. "Elara," he said, taking off his hat. He nodded toward her husband with politeness that seemed forced. "Arturo." "Father," Elara replied coldly. "What brings you here?" Don Carmelo looked around the property, clearly impressed with what he saw. The farm had prospered even more in recent months, with improvements that reflected the perfect partnership between Arturo and Elara. New corrals, smart irrigation systems, a small but functional school for the workers' children, all evidence of management that combined prosperity with social responsibility. "I've come to talk about some business," Don Carmelo finally said. "What kind of business?" Don Arturo asked, his arm protectively around Elara's waist. Don Carmelo took a deep breath, as if he were about to swallow something bitter. "Perhaps you have heard about the problems that have arisen in our region."
Elara hadn't heard, but she could imagine. What kind of problems?
"The magistrate has been arrested for corruption. Several families are being investigated for their involvement in land appropriation schemes." Don Carmelo paused, clearly uncomfortable. Our family could face some financial difficulties." The irony of the situation was not lost on Elara. The same illegal activities she had tried to expose years earlier were finally being investigated by the real authorities. If her family had listened to her warnings at the time, they could have avoided the scandal. "And what does that have to do with us?" Don Arturo asked. Don Carmelo looked directly at Elara. "We were thinking, perhaps you could intercede for us, use your influence with your husband to help us financially during this difficult period." The silence that followed was deafening. Elara looked at the man who had spent 23 years making her feel inadequate, who had sent her away as if it were punishment for Don Arturo, who had celebrated when he thought he was getting rid of her forever. "Father," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "All my life you told me I was a problem, that my opinions were inconvenient, that my conscience was a flaw. You sent me here believing it was revenge against my husband." Don Carmelo lowered his eyes, clearly uncomfortable. "But now that you need help, suddenly I am someone whose influence is worth something." "Elara, you are our daughter." "A daughter is loved, protected, valued," she interrupted. "I was a burden you finally managed to get rid of. The difference is that you thought you were punishing me, but in reality, you gave me the greatest gift of my life." Don Arturo gently squeezed Alara's hand, a gesture of silent support. "I will not help you financially," she continued, "not because I lack compassion, but because helping you would be enabling the continuation of the same corrupt practices I have always criticized. You made your decisions. Now live with the consequences." Don Carmelo turned red with anger. "After everything we did for you, what did you do for me?" Alara asked, her voice rising slightly. "Make me feel inadequate for having a conscience. Punish me for standing up for what's right. Send me away thinking you were harming an innocent man. We raised you, fed you, educated you. You did the minimum that the law requires of parents, but you never loved me for who I am. Don Arturo has known me for only a few months, and values me more than you did in a lifetime." Don Carmelo looked at Don Arturo with anger. "And you're going to allow your wife to speak like that to her own father?" Don Arturo smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Señor de Valbuena, my wife is free to express her opinions. In fact, it was precisely for this reason that I married her, for the courage you always tried to destroy." Realizing he would not get what he wanted, Don Carmelo returned to the carriage angrily. Alara and Arturo stood hand in hand, watching the carriage drive away. When it was out of sight, Alara turned to her husband. "Did I do the right thing?" "You did the only thing you could do while being who you are," he responded, kissing her forehead. "And I love you even more for it." That night, as they ate dinner in the dining room that was now truly hers, Alara reflected on the extraordinary journey her life had taken. The family who had tried to get rid of her like garbage was now begging for her help. The man who was supposed to be the victim of a cruel joke had become her greatest love and support. "Do you know what the funniest thing about all this is?" she said to Arturo. "What?" "My parents really believed they were playing a joke on you, that they were sending you their defective daughter to ruin your life." Arturo laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the room. "They will never understand that they gave me exactly the treasure I had been searching for all my life." Alara smiled, feeling her heart fill with gratitude. Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst curses. And sometimes, Arturo said, taking her hand across the table, the people who try to hurt us end up directing us toward our true destiny. They finished dinner peacefully, knowing they had built something beautiful and solid together, a partnership based on mutual respect, true love, and shared values. Lara would never again be the rejected daughter. She was now the beloved wife, the respected advisor, the woman who had found her place in the world next to someone who saw her exactly as she was, perfect in her imperfection, valuable in her authenticity, loved in her entirety. 5 years later, their farm had become the most prosperous in the region, not just financially but also socially. The school for workers' children had grown into a real educational center. The water system Alara had suggested had saved them through 3 droughts, and most importantly, they had 3 children of their own, 2 girls and a boy, whom they were raising to have the same strong sense of justice and compassion that had brought their parents together. The Valbuena family eventually lost most of their wealth due to the corruption scandals. Ines and Beatriz, now in their 30s, remained unmarried, still waiting for wealthy husbands who never came. They occasionally sent letters asking for help, but Alara always politely declined, instead sending money directly to help the poor people in their town, the same people her family had once exploited. Don Carmelo and Doña Leonor spent their remaining years regretting the day they had gotten rid of the daughter who could have saved them from their own greed and dishonesty. But Alara rarely thought about them anymore. She was too busy living the happy, meaningful life she had always dreamed of having. And sometimes, when she was walking through her beautiful garden or watching her children play in the fields, She would remember that Tuesday morning when the letter arrived, the letter her family thought would be their revenge, but which turned out to be the key to her greatest happiness. The girl nobody wanted had become the woman everybody admired. The family's mistake had become her greatest blessing, and the cruel joke had become the most beautiful love story anyone could imagine.